Okay. Hello, everyone. I just wanted to wait a little bit um, to see if people fit in, but we can get started on the introductions at least. I'm Divya Negi. I'm the vice chair of IPAC Manitoba. I'd like to just start the session with a Manitoba land acknowledgement, mainly because we are on Manitoba land. Um, so let's get started. So IPAC Manitoba is located on ancestral lands of Anishinaabe and Innuit, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene, and on the homeland of the Métis. We acknowledge the distinct histories of the 7 numbered treaties that apply on this land. We recognize that the public administration and the public policy have been used as tools of colonialism and the harm this has caused Indigenous people. We're committed to promoting public administration in a way that advances reconciliation and a spirit of collaboration with Indigenous peoples and communities. Okay, thank you all for joining us for the last event of our emergency management series. I'm thrilled to introduce our speaker for today, Erin Robbins. Erin is currently the Director of Recovery and Mitigation for the Government of Manitoba. Erin has worked with the province since 2004 in a variety of transportation and emergency management related positions. She also has 4 years of experience with recovery programming, and she also currently directs the Disaster Financial Assistance Program in Manitoba. I will hand it off to Erin now, but I also ask that when we do the Q&A part of this session, that participants use the Q&A function as opposed to the chat function that won't be available. It'd just be easier for us to extrapolate questions and answers from that. Okay, thank you. Erin, take it away.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much, Divya, for the introduction, and to IPAC for hosting these webinars, which I think have been really valuable. So I'm here today to speak about recovery and mitigation. So as Divya mentioned, I'm the acting director of recovery and mitigation programs at Manitoba EMO. I have behind me a really strong team of public administration professionals that are helping me look good today with my presentation. So I just want to send a shout out to them before I start. Thank you very much for all of the material, and I'll get right into it. Today's presentation will cover Manitoba EMO programs. So programming, which has been in place for some time in Manitoba, so that would be more of the recovery side of things. I'm also going to cover the 2022 spring flood event in Manitoba that happened last year. And then I'll move on to EMO's mitigation programs, which is a newer area for Manitoba EMO. I'll close the presentation with a discussion of how Manitoba EMO is evolving in order to focus on reducing disaster impacts. And there'll be about 15 to 20 minutes at the end for questions or areas for discussion raised by you, the audience. Manitoba EMO falls under the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure in the Manitoba government. Responsibilities fall under the Emergency Measures Act. Our vision at Manitoba EMO is a safe Manitoba that is resilient to all hazards, emergencies, and disasters. Our mission is to work continuously with all partners by coordinating and integrating activities to mitigate against, prepare for, respond to, and recover from emergencies and disasters. We also identify 4 key values at in our division, which are partnership, agility, accountability, and integrity that assist Manitoba EMO in meeting the objectives of our mission and vision. So the value of partnership for us is to continuously engage with partners in a collaborative, coordinated, and integrated manner. The value of agility means to us the application of timely, creative, and innovative proactive approaches. For accountability, we want to ensure trust and transparency through reporting, information sharing, and compliance with standards. And finally, our value of integrity is to provide a consistent and uncompromised adherence to effective, efficient, and high-quality service. So just for the benefit of participants, Manitoba EMO is made up of two branches, the Preparedness and Response branch and the Recovery and Mitigation branch, which I will be discussing today. Manitoba EMO's recovery branch develops recovery policy to ensure that Manitobans are able to recover after a disaster. A big part of our work is the administration of the Disaster Financial Assistance Program and Manitoba's claims under the Federal Disaster Financial Assistance Arrangements. We provide training and education to stakeholders so that they understand the programs and have resources available during the stressful recovery period. In recent years, recovery has taken a more holistic approach to programming by modernizing the DFA program to introduce digital methods of collecting information and paperless processes, maximizing available funds recovered under the Federal Disaster Financial Assistance Arrangements. We're also enhancing service delivery and improve collaboration efforts with partners and stakeholders. And we are really fostering and advancing innovation through collaborative tools and techniques in our branch. We have also branched out to work more collaboratively with other areas of our department on important issues such as communicating flood risk maps to the public and sitting on national working groups such as the Flood Insurance and Relocation Project and the federally led review of Canada's disaster financial assistance arrangements. So you might be asking, what is disaster financial assistance, or DFA? So when a natural disaster occurs, the Manitoba government may declare the event eligible for DFA. DFA is an assistance program that is often cost shared with the Government of Canada under the Federal Disaster Financial Assistance Arrangements. DFA provides assistance with basic and essential items which are uninsurable. We assist with costs during the 3 stages of disasters, so the preemptive phase, the response phase, and the recovery phase. And my slide up there just lists some of the different costs we assist with under each of those phases of disasters. So sandbags, for example, in the preemptive costs, response costs might include things like mandatory evacuations and pumping water. And recovery costs include everything from cleanup and debris removal to restoring homes to a functional state to assisting with livestock losses related to flooding. Not every disaster event will trigger a DFA program. In order for Manitoba to establish a DFA program, certain criteria must be met. So the event must be geographically widespread and affect a large area or large number of residents. Damages must be mostly uninsurable, and damages must represent a significant financial burden to the communities affected. So we do review a variety of factors, including community impact assessments and financial records, in order to determine this. Furthermore, Manitoba aims to maximize cost sharing with the Government of Canada on these programs. Canada will only contribute when the eligible costs for an event exceed a certain threshold that's based on population. So currently, Manitoba's disaster costs must meet the threshold of $4.7 million in order to be cost shared by Canada. Manitoba may share costs for DFA programs with the Government of Canada through what's called the Disaster Financial Assistance Arrangements, or DFAA. These arrangements between Canada and the provinces or territories set out which costs are eligible for assistance for provincial departments, local authorities, private residences, small businesses, farms, and nonprofit organizations. DFAA also sets out standards for documentation and auditing. Records are typically required to be detailed and exhaustive. If Manitoba cannot verify details about costs submitted, Manitoba will not receive cost sharing for those items. Manitoba does align as closely as possible with the DFAA in order to maximize cost sharing and to pass federal audit. DFA is provided for various affected groups in the private and public sector. These include municipal governments, Manitoba's provincial departments, which in the past have included the Department of Transportation and Infrastructure, Families, Environment, Climate and Parks, Indigenous Reconciliation and Northern Relations, and other departments that have incurred event-related costs. Under the public sector, we also assist watershed districts and water co-ops. We also assist the private sector under the DFA program. So private sector claims may include private residences, including both tenants and owners. And just to note that secondary homes such as cottages are not eligible. Small businesses are also eligible for DFA as long as they meet eligibility criteria that are set out under the DFAA. Farms are also available, are also eligible. And finally, nonprofit organizations are eligible for DFA as long as they have a facility that's fully available to the community and they provide an essential service. So I'm just going to switch gears here and give everyone a little bit of a recap of the 2022 Spring Flood Program, which hit Manitoba last year. So I'll start with an overview of the event, and then I'll get into a little bit of an explanation of sort of how the event unfolded in Manitoba, just so you can kind of see DFA in action here. The 2022 Spring Flood DFA program is the largest DFA program since 2011 in terms of total volume claims. Manitoba EMO received 115 public sector applications, making up the majority of municipalities in Manitoba. So you'll see from the map I have up here on the slide, this event really did impact most of southern and central Manitoba. We received over 2,200 private applications, including over 1,000 private residential claims, over 1,000 farm claims, 113 small business claims, and 24 claims from nonprofit organizations. During this event, the impacts began as early as March 20th and included 11 major precipitation events from April 13th to July 20th. The 2022 spring flood was unusual for a number of reasons, but its extended time frame caused a number of challenges. In most flood years, we're used to seeing either a gradual spring flood, which recedes in the spring, or severe rain events, which are over quickly. In 2022, we saw a spring flood caused by record-breaking snowfalls in parts of the province, followed up by a series of storms. From the early April Colorado lows, which brought mostly snowfall, to later rainstorms, which caused flash flooding. Water levels never had a chance to fully recede between storm systems, and as such, only contributed to further flooding. So this slide here shows the water levels on the Red River at Emerson. So for those of you that might not be familiar with Manitoba, I've just put a little map here of Manitoba. So the Red River flows from North Dakota in the south up through Manitoba, through Winnipeg and into Lake Winnipeg. So you can kind of get a sense of where the river is here. So this graph is called a hydrograph, and it plots the elevation of the water over time from February 28th to July 31st. Also plotted on this graph are the various storm events we experienced in 2022. So look for the dotted vertical lines here. As you can see, water levels rose quickly in March, but took a long time to leave flood stage. The various storm events seen throughout the flood kept water levels from returning to normal until well into summer. This slide shows a similar hydrograph for the Winnipeg River in the same time period. So again, I've just copied in a little map of the Winnipeg River. So you, if you're not familiar with Manitoba, you get a good sense of where it is. So this is the Manitoba-Ontario border right here. This is Kenora in Northwest Ontario. And so the Winnipeg River sort of comes from the Lake of the Woods and flows into Lake Winnipeg. Water levels really took off in May in the Winnipeg River system, and again took a long time to start going down due to the repeated rain events that lasted well into summer. The flooding on the Winnipeg River reached record highs in 2022, even with all Manitoba hydro dams operating to let through the maximum amount of water possible. Lake Winnipeg was the last water body to return to normal levels in 2022 and only entered its recommended operating range on October 31st. Again, I just have a map here of Manitoba, just showing you where Lake Winnipeg is. So this is the Canada-US border down below here. Winnipeg is here, and Lake Winnipeg is just north of Winnipeg. So the lake often responds to flooding more slowly as it is downstream of Manitoba's various river systems, such as the Winnipeg River, the Red River, and the Saskatchewan River. Wind tides, sometimes called seiches, were an issue on Lake Winnipeg in 2022. You will see on the hydrograph that the levels fluctuated much more than we saw on the previous two river systems. You'll recall from earlier in the presentation that Manitoba aligns its DFA program with the federal DFAA in order to receive cost sharing. The DFAA states the linking of separate disastrous events into one DFAA request is not permitted, with the exception of general spring flooding in a defined area, including secondary flooding caused by storms. So in the past years and in past events, these rules have meant storm events have been treated separately from spring floods. For example, in 2014, Manitoba saw both spring flooding as a result of rapid snowmelt and also severe flash flooding related to storms around Canada Day. So if you take a look at this hydrograph provided by the Water Survey of Canada, you'll notice that there is a significant drop in water levels between the spring peak and the July peak on the Red River at Emerson, Manitoba. The 2014 spring flood and the 2014 June heavy rains were two separate events and two separate DFA programs. So where Manitoba had to reach the cost sharing threshold with Canada for both events separately. If we take another look at the 2022 hydrograph for the Red River at Emerson, you'll notice there are smaller peaks and valleys, but levels remain high well into the summer. This is why Manitoba EMO was able to fit multiple precipitation events into one DFA program. Manitoba EMO considers this to be an unusual occurrence, as flood events are usually more separate and well-defined in Manitoba. In future years, each precipitation event will be treated as a separate event, and 2022's unusual event does not represent a new way of administering these programs. Now I'm going to switch gears into talking a little bit more about Manitoba EMO's mitigation program area. In 2019, Manitoba EMO began working towards a mitigation program area in an effort to ensure that all four pillars of emergency management were addressed through Manitoba EMO's mandate. The increasing scale and scope of disasters is causing a shift in focus towards mitigation in order to prevent or limit future disaster impacts and the related response and recovery costs. The branch works to develop recovery policies and mitigation guidelines that will move Manitoba to a more proactive mode of action on disasters, reduce future disaster impacts, reduce the fiscal burden of disasters, and increase the resiliency for the province, municipalities, and the public. Really, we want to be able to prevent or prepare for disasters before they happen so we can eliminate or reduce the impact of those disasters. This is where mitigation is important. Disaster mitigation measures are those that eliminate or reduce the impacts and risks of hazards through proactive measures taken before an emergency or disaster occurs. One of the best known examples of investment in disaster mitigation is the Red River floodway, as seen in this picture. But there are many other large and small scale examples across Manitoba. An all hazards emergency management approach looks at all potential risks and impacts, natural and human induced, to ensure that decisions made to mitigate against one type of risk do not increase our vulnerability to other risks. Disaster mitigation measures may be structural, so for example, flood dikes, or non-structural, for example, land use, zoning, or planning. Mitigation activities should incorporate the measurement and assessment of the evolving risk environment. Activities may include the creation of comprehensive, proactive tools that help decide where to focus funding and efforts in risk reduction. Other examples of mitigation measures include hazard mapping, adoption and enforcement of land use and zoning practices, implementing and enforcing building codes, floodplain mapping, reinforced tornado-safe rooms, sorry about that, burying of electrical cables to prevent ice buildup, raising of homes in flood-prone areas, disaster mitigation public awareness programs, and insurance programs. The most effective emergency management activities are proactive prevention mitigation measures that are used to eliminate, reduce, or adapt to risks. The return on investment for these activities, while dependent on hazard type and location, would generate savings of about $13 to $15 for every $1 invested in adaptation and prevention measures. These activities also support opportunities to build more resilient infrastructure while integrating environmental protection and sustainable development concepts. So given that the increasing scale and scope of disasters is causing a shift in focus toward mitigation, Manitoba EMO's mitigation program area is aiming to reduce the impact of severe weather events, to reduce DFA claims, to increase resiliency, to improve the understanding of risks and insurance of risk, to encourage mitigation programming uptake, to identify gaps and create programming or funding opportunities to support these gaps, and to develop innovative programming. To help achieve these goals, Manitoba has started to deliver programs and initiatives that we would like to share today. First is the Residential Home Flood Protection Subsidy. Second is our Mitigation Funding Catalog. Third is our newer Mitigation and Preparedness Program. And then at the end, I'll cover some larger policy discussions that Manitoba has been a part of at the federal level. So Manitoba EMO is offering funding to DFA claimants who experienced basement flooding in the spring of 2022 to purchase and install home flood protection equipment through the Residential Flood Protection Subsidy. We have been communicating this subsidy to DFA claimants at their DFA inspection and again through the DFA evaluation process. The Residential Flood Protection Subsidy is optional for homeowners, but does provide a great avenue for individuals to work toward building resiliency within their own home. So the program is meant to reduce homeowners' exposure to basement flooding, to reduce future disaster recovery costs, and to strengthen community resiliency to future weather events. So you'll see in the slide there's a picture of a sump, pump, and pit, something that you all hopefully have installed in your home. Under this program, homeowners are eligible to receive up to a maximum of $1,250 for the purchase and installation of a backwater valve. So that's just to prevent sewer backup. $2,500 for the purchase and installation of a sump pump and pit, or $1,000 for the purchase and installation of a sump pump battery backup. The reimbursement of the subsidy funding occurs through the DFA program once the work is completed and paid for. We are also actively working on developing a mitigation funding catalog on our Manitoba EMO website. We are hoping to be a one-stop shop for all mitigation and disaster reduction funding sources for municipalities and individuals. This is meant to provide access to funding opportunities regardless of the funding source. So you should be able to find provincial, federal, and funding from other sources such as the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. If you know of a funding opportunity that's not listed, please email us at emomitigation@gov.mb.ca. This is just a quick highlight of what our website looks like. Here you'll see a mitigation funding opportunity for individuals. We've included a high-level summary of the funding program and a link to the funding provider's website. In 2020, the Manitoba government announced that it would be modernizing the DFA program, including updating the cost-sharing formula with municipalities that had not been adjusted since 2009. Beginning in 2020, municipalities would now be asked to absorb $3.25 per capita for disaster costs, up from $1 per capita, before the provincial DFA cost-sharing formula applies. Additionally, municipalities will have to pay more at each stage of the sliding scale funding formula. The new formula is similar to the federal provincial funding formula and increases annually in alignment with the Consumer Price Index. So the challenge for us is that the updated cost-sharing formula, while it more accurately shares the cost of damages with municipalities, ultimately meant higher response and recovery costs to municipalities. In order to reduce response and recovery costs, investments in mitigation are essential. But with municipalities paying more for response and recovery through the DFA program, how can they afford to pay to mitigate as well? To solve this problem, Manitoba EMO put forward the idea of giving municipalities the option to either pay for response and recovery costs or invest that same amount of money in mitigation activities. The idea proposed that municipalities with damages from a disaster event could either pay the municipal share of their DFA claim, or they could invest that same amount of money into a mitigation project. So now in Manitoba, when a disaster that is eligible for federal cost sharing occurs, an MPP program will also be announced, and municipalities will be notified that there is an approved DFA program and MPP program that they can apply to. The MPP program is an optional program to assist municipalities to mitigate against future disasters. And with the MPP, Manitoba EMO was looking to think more innovatively beyond the current recovery policies. One of the biggest concerns that municipalities and provinces have with the federal DFA program is that recovery funding will only bring sites back to pre-disaster condition. This obviously continues to leave vulnerabilities and risks across the landscape. So unlike the DFA program, the MPP does not have to be invested in a site that was damaged during the disaster. The MPP amount can be invested in any disaster mitigation and preparedness project that will benefit the municipality. Manitoba is also very encouraged by recent comments from the Government of Canada that a renewed DFAA will go beyond repairing to pre-disaster condition and will also focus on mitigation. The foundation of the MPP is based on the following set of guiding principles. First, that investments are cost-effective and evidence-based. So our program, we're really looking for a positive return on investment on these projects. The second guiding principle is that projects include regional implications. So impacts should be considered on neighboring municipalities, and if applicable, evidence of collaboration with other municipalities or nonprofits are shown. The third guiding principle are that projects focus on the management of risk. So selected projects must mitigate a risk identified in a municipal emergency plan, or funding can also be used to better understand hazards, risks, and vulnerabilities in the municipality. The fourth guiding principle is that partnerships are developed where possible. So municipalities can partner on investments in mitigation equipment that will benefit both municipalities and make more efficient use of funding. Funding can also be pooled to partner on projects that will mitigate common risks in a regional area. Our fifth guiding principle is that a sustainable approach is undertaken. So we'd like projects to consider impact on the natural environment, and projects can also take a nature-based approach. And the final guiding principle of the MPP program is that the projects lead to resilient communities. We want community leaders to adopt a long-term, holistic, and community-reflective perspective when selecting their projects. So for our 2022 MPP program, a total of approximately $700,000 will be invested in mitigation activities across 18 different municipalities. For our 2022 MPP program that's tied to the spring flood we had last year, approximately $7 million in mitigation funding is available to invest across 91 municipalities, including a whopping $5 million mitigation investment in the city of Winnipeg. We are really proud of the participation rate in our MPP program, which is approximately 90% of eligible municipalities. This uptake was the result of directly reaching out to municipalities and offering a number of webinars to municipalities shortly after the 2022 spring flood happened and a DFA program was announced. So some of the more notable 2022 MPP project examples include a flood mitigation study and drainage plan, the purchase of sandbagging machines, the purchase of generators, raising roads, the purchase of culvert steamers, and purchasing water pumps. We also had many municipalities opt to set up a reserve fund with the MPP amount. This allows them to save the money and pool it with future MPP program amounts or other dedicated mitigation funding and take a bit more time to consider their project. EMO is planning a session with municipalities in May that have set up a reserve fund to share some information on project ideas and what other municipalities are doing with their funding. And we really like a few of the more innovative MPP projects to have come out of this program so far. So one is a 1 in 200 year flood risk mapping project put forward by the RM of McDonald on the LaSalle River. And it will be used in development controls and planning of flood mitigation infrastructure for the community. Another innovative idea was the purchasing of flood damaged private property for future public use in the town of Neepawa. And this is part of a $2 million plan to assist in mitigation and preparedness for future disaster in that town. Another innovative project we saw was the equipment purchase for the Emergency Operations and Reception Center in the town of Toulon. So they purchased items such as crowd control delineators, volunteer vests, wool blankets, duffel bags, trauma kits, first aid kits, and signage. Manitoba EMO is also involved in broader policy development in the mitigation sphere, including Manitoba was a strong presence in the Government of Canada's recent review of the federal disaster financial assistance arrangements. Manitoba advocated heavily for increased mitigation funding as part of the recovery process and the need to build back better after disaster events occur. Manitoba also participated in the Flood Insurance and Relocation Project, which is a federal, provincial, territorial, and industry task force that is designed to examine options for the provision of a low-cost flood insurance program for Canadians that are at high risk of flooding and are typically uninsurable. My branch is also looking closely at funding opportunities and priorities under Canada's National Adaptation Strategy and funding opportunities that we can leverage right away to support the growth of mitigation in Manitoba. An important priority for us as well is working closely with other areas of government where flooding risks are being mapped and determining how this information can be made available to ensure that Manitobans are aware of their risks. At this point in time, most of our programming, such as the MPP and Residential Home Flood Protection Subsidy, are linked to our recovery processes. We at Manitoba EMO recognize the need to move to a more proactive and less reactive approach on mitigation programming and support. We do have plans that build on the success of our previously delivered programs. Our goal is to provide broader provincial support for municipalities and private individuals to reduce hazard vulnerability. As we move into the mitigation sphere, we recognize we need to lay the groundwork. There are three key pieces we believe are crucial to this groundwork, including understanding and explaining the risk and benefits of mitigation, continually engaging with stakeholders, and the need for dedicated funding. Although we do know that for every $1 invested in mitigation, we save $13 to $15, but we need to bring this home to Manitoba. We are starting work on analyzing previous disaster programs in Manitoba, where damages occur most often, and how investments in these areas could provide direct savings in recovery costs moving forward. We also recognize the need to engage with stakeholders in the mitigation sphere to gather information on that risk based on experiences out there in municipalities or based on research being undertaken in our post-secondary educational institutions. We are also looking at tools that are already in place and have information on where the risks are in Manitoba, such as municipal hazard risk and vulnerability assessments, the Prairie Climate Center's Climate Atlas, and flood risk maps that are currently available. We also realize we need to expand beyond looking at flood risk alone to all hazards. Secondly, we know that there are important partnerships we need to leverage with other governments, the insurance industry, the real estate sector, and not-for-profits in the sphere of mitigation. For example, the insurance industry has a huge stake in reducing costs related to recovery. What are they doing to help us build mitigation in Manitoba? Finally, to effectively build mitigation in Manitoba, we need dedicated and regular funding, and this is something we are prioritizing in the short term. As we do grow into this mitigation space, we realize that mitigation overlaps with other areas of government and the private and not-for-profit sector. There is a need to identify gaps and opportunities for EMO programming without duplicating efforts. And there's also a need to ensure a mitigation lens is applied to many activities, for example, land use planning and asset management. So that takes me to the end of my presentation for today. I do have time for questions or discussion, and just for your information, that picture there is a picture of Highway 75 near Morris, Manitoba, which is very much in the south of Manitoba, but that's sort of just some of the flooding we get in the spring here in Manitoba.
Thank you, Erin. I do think we have at least 3 questions, so that's good. So the first one is, how does EMO ensure that municipalities are properly managing their reserve funds so that they end up being used for mitigation projects?
Sure. So we do sign a contribution agreement with the municipalities before we provide them with the MPP funds. And we do also work very closely with the Department of Municipal Relations, which does provide oversight for municipal finances and reserve funds, that we sort of just keep an eye on that reserve fund moving forward as well.
Sounds good. Yeah, no, that's interesting. So there's another question about DFA. What are some of the changes that EMO is anticipating to DFAA, and how could it impact our existing program that exists in Manitoba?
Right. So I think just based on some of the comments and signals I've been hearing back from the Government of Canada on a renewed DFAA would be, and we're very much hoping for more mitigation funding for provinces and territories when they do have a DFA program. So that would allow us to move beyond repairing to pre-disaster condition and allow us to actually invest in enhancing infrastructure so that it would be less prone to damage in the future. So that's, I think, one of the main areas that we're going to be working toward and look toward. Also with the work we're doing with the federal government and other provinces and territories and industry in the flood insurance and relocation project. As flood insurance becomes more available in Manitoba through either the private industry or as it becomes available as a national product through this working group. There will be, I think, less DFA assistance for homeowners, private homeowners in Canada moving forward, as long as those other products are in place and they do have access to insurance to insure their risk. So those are probably the two areas that I see changing the future.
Yeah, no, that's interesting, especially the mitigation part. Okay, I think the next is, as commercial flood insurance becomes more prevalent, will there come a point where DFA won't cover flood-related damage? Will homeowners be expected to have flood insurance if they're in a flood-prone area?
Yeah, so this is really interesting. So flood insurance is available in Manitoba and has been since 2016. I think, unfortunately, what we see through the DFA program is Manitobans are not always aware that they could purchase overland flood insurance. And I think some Manitobans are just also not aware of their risks. So as it becomes more available, right now the DFA program still covers assistance for overland flooding, just because right now the uptake for overland flood insurance in Manitoba is still fairly low. So we only see probably about 30% of Manitobans actually having purchased overland flood insurance. But as that becomes a greater percentage of Manitobans that do that, we will have to look at DFA, our DFA program and our policies, just because DFA, we don't want to overlap with what insurance provides, right? Because often the coverage you can get through insurance is much more comprehensive than what DFA assistance can provide. And then too, as I was talking about, there is work toward a national flood risk or a national flood insurance product as well. So as that becomes available across Canada, the need for DFA will decrease as well. So yeah.
Yeah, no, sounds good. This is an interesting one. Can Manitoba Parks access the mitigation fund?
Oh, okay. Thank you, Chris, for that question. So Manitoba Parks cannot access the Mitigation and Preparedness program. That's a program that's between the province and municipalities. But I have been speaking with a director at Parks to talk about some of the other mitigation funding opportunities that might be available through the DFA program. And it's a conversation that I'm going to continue on with him. So Chris, I'm sure you probably know who I'm talking about. So I would connect with the director there, and I'll get you some more information about that in the near future.
Awesome. Okay. So is there a role for micro insurance in the recovery and mitigation mix of initiatives at EMO?
Sorry, I'm not familiar with micro insurance.
Ooh, I am also not actually. I wonder if we can have Belfour explain that. Erin, could you unmute him? Her?
Sure.
Them?
And I would do that. Okay, chat. I am not very technologically savvy, so I can click on Balfour and chat.
Oh, that's okay. I was talking to Bellwood. Erin
Okay.
Bellwood in our background people.
Perfect. I'm glad you weren't relying on me.
No, that's okay. I was hoping she can empower.
Oh, yeah, to come up, and that was Belfour?
Yes, please.
Just takes a few seconds.
Oh, good. I wonder if they'd want to talk anyway.
Okay, so this is Balfour.
Hello.
Okay. So I had the question about microinsurance. Microinsurance is a type of insurance that caters to people who normally don't qualify for normal insurance. It's a type of insurance that is based on usually hydrometeorological parameters, such as the amount of rainfall, the wind speed, that kind of thing. What it means is that because it's parametric based, there's no need to conduct a risk assessment at the front end of the insurance process or to conduct a loss assessment on the back end of the insurance process. The front end and back end assessment can account for as much as 40% of insurance cost. So microinsurance eliminates that.
Okay.
And therefore it's cheaper to access. It allows better access for people who normally wouldn't qualify for normal insurance. The other thing is that because payout for these type of insurance are fixed, it quite often encourages mitigation strategies. So
that is very interesting.
Yeah.
What I can tell you, I don't have a lot of knowledge about that, but in the chat, I was just going to copy in a link to the task force on flood insurance and relocation, because when you said the word parametric and sort of different insurance models, the task force did look at 6 different kinds of insurance. And that was one of the types or the kinds of insurance that the task force did examine. And they kind of looked at like the costs and benefits of different types of insurance. So you could likely find quite a bit more information there about sort of how that's being considered in the bigger picture of developing a flood insurance product for Canadians at high risk of flooding. But aside from that, I probably don't have too much to offer you in terms of an answer.
Thanks much.
No problem. I'm going to get that into the chat before I forget.
Yeah, for sure. We did have another interesting one, but I'll let you finish.
Sure, I hope. I got it in there. Okay, you can go ahead with the next question.
Awesome. So Zen says, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Zen says, I don't see any role for public health involved in the flooding or emergency management. Maybe they're not very familiar with the organizational structure in Manitoba. Would it be possible for such a role to exist when it comes to urgent events? So I think what they're trying to do is figure out how COVID came into the mix of emergency management and public health at large.
Okay. You know what? Do you mind repeating that question, Divya?
Yeah, so Zen says that they don't see any role of public health involved in like flooding or emergency management, but maybe they're not very familiar with the organizational structure. Would it be possible for such a role to exist when it comes to urgent events? Role of public health.
The role of public health. Well, typically, like we do work on any kind of disaster or emergency event. more so in the other branch, on the preparedness and response side, they work very closely with a number of partners, including public health. So they are sort of part of the preparedness and response side of emergencies. They're brought in and sort of collaborated with throughout the actual emergency phase. So like EMO does work with those partners, including public health, in the emergency response phase.
Awesome. Yeah, I agree with you. Okay, I think the next is integrated watershed management plans are developed by watershed districts designed designated water planning authorities under the Water Protection Act to increase watershed resiliency to floods and droughts and adapt to the impacts of climate change. Has EMO provided input into watershed plan development, or is there an opportunity for such an input?
Yeah, so we definitely are like aware of it. We do have a watershed district included in our MPP program for the 2022 spring flood. So we are making those connections with watershed districts because we do realize, of course, that mitigation activities go beyond, and disaster events go beyond like a municipal boundary. So it is something that we're sort of branching out into and considering as we move forward in mitigation. But because we're sort of earlier on in the program development phase of mitigation, we haven't developed anything formal yet, but it's sort of on our list of things to tackle.
Good. Bridget asks, is there a way to obtain assistance to help clients, such as farmers, that cannot use the computer to fill their DFA applications?
For sure. So we do offer the option of paper applications and using the mail through for our DFA program as well. And we can also provide assistance to anyone that requires it for filling out applications, that kind of thing. So we definitely do have clients that don't have access to computers or use them regularly that we do help with our program.
Okay, awesome. Those are all the questions I had. I'm going to wait maybe a minute more and see if somebody else has another question. In the meantime, I had an interesting question. Maybe this has no space right now, but I was thinking about how Johanna had talked about this early on in the first event, but essentially how the scope of emergency management is expanding to also cater to something called human caused events, for the lack of a better term. I can't remember the term exactly, but essentially, for example, we're working on the Ukraine task force, right? The Ukrainian refugee task force. I wonder if there's any space to think about mitigation in those arenas where it isn't necessarily infrastructure or hard things that you can create and develop and then hence mitigate a disaster, but mitigation of possibly stretching our programs at last minute, having to figure out how to deal with a large refugee influx and so on and so forth.
Yeah. So I definitely, like, in terms of mitigation that EMO was focused on, I'm not sure that it would apply super well, but I do sort of recognize like the benefit of being prepared for those types of situations to occur. Like those type of refugee sort of crisis situations are going to happen and likely going to happen and continue to happen in the future. And so how can Manitoba prepare to like assist in those situations? So I think like having sort of something less ad hoc and something more formal built into Manitoba to sort of deal with those emerging situations, because we know they're going to happen, is probably something Manitoba could do just to be more prepared and have sort of like a structure in place to sort of handle those crises. And yeah, so that's sort of something I can kind of just think of off the top of my head.
No, that makes sense. It made more sense for it to fit in preparation anyway, but I just wondered if there was scope for it in mitigation. Anyway, that's all the questions we had. I do want to, before we move on, I believe there aren't any questions coming in. No, they're not. So before we move on and end the session, I would like to thank IPAC National, Erin Bellwood, who's in our background, for supporting the Emergency Management Event Series at a Canada-wide level. I would also like to thank you, Erin Robbins, and Manitoba Emergency Management Organization at large for their collaboration with this series. Finally, I would also like to thank all the participants for attending and for all of their awesome questions. And I'll end it with that. Until next time, have a good day, you all.
Thank you.